Welcome to Hot Science Cool Talks. Tonight is the 115th Hot Science Cool Talk. That's incredible. Fire ants, crazy ants, and zombie ants. It will be given by Dr. Rob Plowes, who's with the Department of Integrative Biology here at the University of Texas. Rob is originally born and raised in Zimbabwe and is housed back down to a nature reserve. So in terms of biology, he had an installation of that from a very early age, being out right on top of where all this wildlife was. But then he went to the University of Zimbabwe in Rhodesia, and he majored in electrical engineering. But then he saw the light, and he came to the University of Texas and enrolled in the PhD program in biology. And since that time, he's been involved with a lot of different research, including research on invasive species, and in particular, as you hear tonight, fire ants. He's one of the leaders of the research that's going on here at the Brackenridge Field Lab, which is part of the University of Texas. It's right on Lake Austin Boulevard, as you may not even know that it's out there, the golf course on your way out to the hula hut. It's just on the opposite side. It's an amazing, very unique research facility near a major urban center. Not many like it in the world. And tonight, Rob is going to tell us about his research that his team is doing there. So please welcome Dr. Plowes.
Thanks, Jay. That's great. And sorry, I haven't got any dripping makeup on, but yeah, we can't all do that. So tonight, my talk is going to be, let's see, where are we? There we go. I'm going to be focusing on fire ants and crazy ants and zombie ants, as Jay says. But before I start with that, I do want to thank the organizers and all of you guys in the audience for coming out here tonight. I think it's really been a fabulous series. I've been attending it for quite a few years now and have always appreciated that connection between the university and the public. So I'm really honored to be here as part of this tonight as well. Now, you've all heard of zombie movies, The Walking Dead, the apocalypses and everything, right? But I wonder how many of you really think that zombies exist. So tonight, as I talk about the fire ants and crazy ants, a little mention of zombie ants, I'm going to give you some background, some ideas, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you feel that zombies actually do exist. Now, as Jay says, I grew up in Zimbabwe in Africa, and Africa is also the home of zombies and voodoo and mambas and hyenas and all kinds of other frightening creatures, real or imagined. And some of them, zombies, appear to have moved across through staging grounds in the Caribbean and have arrived in the New World, where they've pretty much entered our collective consciousness, and we now see them in various places in the media and movies. Not entirely sure if they're real, but what we could say is that zombies are invaders of the New World. And I'm going to start by showing you this little video clip that came off YouTube, and it seems to show two things. At one level, we've got ants engaged in a really bizarre behavior, right? They appear to be loading petals, flower petals, onto a bumblebee, a dead bee, and we don't know whether they're doing this because it's some elaborate funeral rite, or they have some obsession with death or fear of zombies. But on another level, I'd put to you that what we're seeing here is an amazing complexity of behavior. We're seeing simple organisms, simple little insects, behaving with what looks like a greater goal in mind. And it's that complexity that I want you to think about here a little. And keep this video in mind, because later on we'll circle back to it and talk a little. The video and the complexity of ants brings to mind that ants are superorganisms. So we think of them, a colony of ants, not just as a bunch of insects, a bunch of ordinary organisms, as you would, say, cockroaches or locusts, which may have, you would never imagine that they would have created that funeral pyre. But we think of colonies of ants as superorganisms showing advanced social organization. And the basis of this is that they have colonies formed around a queen with sterile workers. And those workers have given up their right and their capacity to reproduce in favor and support of the queen's reproduction. We also know that ant colonies communicate extensively, and communication is a hallmark. They communicate by means of pheromones, by sounds, touch, odors. Pheromones are little chemicals which are produced by glands. They have about 20 glands on them. Each of these pheromones is associated with a particular activity. And that creates this complex capacity to have behaviors that would be emergent, that would not otherwise be foreseen. So another weird behavior that or a property of these colonies is that fire ant larvae serve as the centralized digestive system. They serve as the stomach of the colony. And what do I mean by this? Well, imagine, if you will, that a worker ant is out foraging for food and it finds a little food particle. It could try to be selfish and just swallow that item of food, but it can't, because it's got a fine filter at the back of its throat that only allows it to swallow liquids. So it has to take that particle of food back into the colony, and there it feeds it to the larvae. The larvae are essentially just little sacs of digestive enzymes, and they process the food, and once that's all processed and liquid, they spit it back, they regurgitate it back into the mouth of the worker ants, who go on to share it around the colony. We call this trophallaxis. Of course, it's that's the elegant way of getting around saying that they're spitting and vomiting food into each other's mouths. But again, this is a hallmark of the complexity of ant colonies. And again, we look and see inside a colony. Over here, we've got a queen, and surrounded by her workers and the larvae and brood. And the queen, if you look at the rear end, is attended by a lot of other workers who are looking out for eggs. She can lay about 1,000 eggs a day, and so essentially what you're looking at here is a nice big maternity care center for fire ants. Now, I mentioned emergent properties of ant colonies. What do I mean by emergent properties or behavior? These are things that you would never foresee if you just looked at the individual workers. So in this particular case here, we have a raft of fire ants which are floating on water. How do they do this? They self-assemble by grabbing hold of each other's arms and linking together, and they have this they have this activity, this behavior that you would never have foreseen if you just considered the individuals. They do this because they cooperate. And through cooperation, they build nests, they can defend the colonies, they can forage for food. And this level of swarm intelligence provides us with an organized insect society that, if they were to become invasive, as fire ants do, they would pose a very significant challenge as an invasive species. So as Jay said, my work is at the Brackenridge Field Lab here in Austin. The lab is down on Lake Austin Boulevard on the Colorado River. It's about 80 acres of natural habitat, and it's close into the main campus. It's close enough that we have students and faculty come down on a daily basis to carry out their research or take part in classes. And many of these students have been involved over time with some of the very important research which I'm talking about tonight. And I can see a couple of our past research students in the audience here. So welcome to you guys. Now, why the field station? How does this come into play? Back in the early 1980s, suddenly the field station was invaded by fire ants. And John Crutchfield, who was the resident manager, was in the audience here, and Dr. Larry Gilbert, who was the director. They were quite horrified to find fire ants right on their doorstep. And in a very short amount of time, those fire ants had moved through and expanded up, and you can see in that brown area the spread from 1983 up to 1986. And what was noticed were a couple of interesting aspects about this invasion. First of all, the fire ant colonies were packed really densely on the landscape. They also exhibited hardly any aggression or fighting between these colonies, as you would normally expect for a social insect. Also, the spread was in this kind of wave-like clonal spread across the landscape. Usually you would expect to see some kind of array of new colonies spreading and popping up because the queens would be flying, newly mated queens would fly across and establish colonies on the periphery here. Well, this wasn't the case. You had the slow spread. Now, not only was this interesting and unusual, but the part of major concern was the impact that the fire ants had as they were moving into the field station. So in that little chart over there, you'll see the distribution of ants in the uninfested area, which is in white here. So this is before the fire ants had got in. The ants are ranked there from kind of common to rare species, and that's their abundance in the y-axis. So quite a few ants were in the uninfested area. Now look and see what happens when fire ants come in. So in the infested area, which is down at the bottom, you'll notice that fire ants now dominate, right? They're up at 90 to 100% of the little baits that are put out to survey. They occupy about 90% of those, and very few native ants are left. So this was a really unwanted event at a really important little field station. What's to be done about it? Well, it became a research exercise, and it actually, from the 1980s through to today, research on fire ants has continued, and we will talk a little more about that. But this gives you the context of how we became involved here at UT. Now, how did fire ants become involved in North America? Well, their home range is down in South America, in Argentina and Brazil, and they're found in a very small area. The home range of the individuals that came up to North America come from a block about probably 10 or 20 miles across. That was figured out by doing some pretty cool genetic work. And from there, they got on board a ship with agricultural produce and ended up in North America. Being so good at hitchhiking, they spread across the Americas and into Asia as well. And in more detail, you can see here in this pretty cool graphic from USDA, the spread of fire ants as they entered Mobile, Alabama in about 1930s. They spread north up to this kind of cold line, which they can't tolerate too much cold, and west to a dry line just in Texas, and then a couple of long-distance dispersal events into the western states. Now, coming from Africa, I imagined that I had encountered all manner of stinging and biting creatures, right? And I thought that coming here to the New World, I would leave those behind. But I was at a barbecue in Houston shortly after I arrived, sitting in a backyard, and you know what happened? I got stung up by fire ants pretty bad. And I gained a whole new respect for stinging insects in the New World. Well, I was intrigued to find that an entomologist here by the name of Justin Schmidt had created a pain index of insect stings. He'd allowed himself to be stung by a whole manner of different insects and ranked them on a 0 to 4 basis. So he also described the pain sensation. And he says of the bullet ant, this is like fire walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch rusty nail grinding in your heel. The tarantula hawk wasp is also a 4. This is blindingly, shockingly electric. A running hairdryer has been dropped into your bubble bath. Okay, so the guy's not only a scientist, he's a poet, he's a connoisseur of sting and pain, right? The harvester ant is bold and unrelenting. Somebody is using a drill to excavate your ingrown toenail. And the acacia ant, I kind of like this. Somebody has fired a staple into your cheek. It really illustrates the pain angle there. But low on the list, only coming in at a 1.2 is the fire ant, right? Sharp and mildly alarming, like walking across a shag carpet and reaching for the light switch. So although fire ants rank low on the scale, they don't usually sting individually, right? If you're going to get stung, it's going to be by a whole bunch of them. And that's because fire ants come from colonies with 10,000, 100,000 workers, and those colonies can be densities of several hundred per acre. So it's not a question of quantity, it's a question of quality, right? Or the other way around, sorry. Yeah. Now, in Texas, we have a history of problem ants coming through. Invasive ants have come through. In the 1980s, the first one is the Argentine ant, and you notice it had no stinger. So having a sting is not a hallmark of being an invasive ant necessarily, but it was followed up pretty soon by the red imported fire ant that came in and displaced in many places the Argentine ant, in the 1950s, arriving in Austin about the 1980s. And then, most recently, the tawny crazy ant has come in, and again, it doesn't have a stinger, and it has in places displaced the other two species, and in other places, the Argentine ant is popping up again. So it's kind of like a rock, paper, scissors turnover story between these three. And it's interesting that they all come from that same region of northern Argentina, where they've probably adapted their behaviors to each other and their defenses to cope with each other, and that possibly has set them up as being potentially aggressive and able to invade North America. So which ant species become problematic enough to be considered invasive and pests? Well, the red imported fire ant is probably at the top of the list, and the main reason is because of its cost. It is estimated to cause about $1.2 billion a year of economic damage in Texas alone, and to infest about 80 million acres of rangeland. But as conservation-minded folk, we're just as concerned about their impacts on native species and the ground nesting birds and animals in particular, and their potential to disrupt food webs, lose various species, knocking out pollinators, losing ecosystem function. So fire ants are certainly of great concern. Now, crazy ants come up next, and they're called crazy because of this frenetic movement, this zigzag running around on the ground that you see here. And as a biologist, I've seen many phenomena in nature, but this first encounter that I had with crazy ants really took my breath away. I was in a small forest just outside of Houston, and there were no bird calls, there were hardly any squirrels in the trees, no insects left, and just billions, if not trillions, of crazy ants on the ground trying to get up my legs. Crazy ants have become a major invader of the Gulf Coast area and into urban settings in particular. There are about 4 very large colonies now here in Travis County. They're probably too big to contemplate getting rid of with pesticides. They are generally spread by human transport. That's by nursery products or agricultural produce or construction materials. They occur at very high densities, as I just described there, and they knock out native fauna. And of interest, as I mentioned previously, they do displace fire ants. Now, that was interesting to us as biologists, right? Here comes something without a stinger, and it's able to knock out a fire ant. What's going on? Well, Ed LeBrun in our lab and a couple of others got together and threw a couple of crazy ants in a tray with some fire ants and sat back to watch what happened. Well, they entered some sort of encounter, and the next thing is fire ants were off sitting in the corner, whimpering in the corner, and crazy ants had dominated and won the fight. So that required digging in a little further, and Ed came up with the explanation. So what happens is when you have an encounter between these two species, the crazy ant goes up, fire ant reacts to it by putting up its abdomen and spraying venom out of its stinger. The crazy ant withdraws off to the side here, and it squirts formic acid from a little pore on its abdomen, and this wet formic acid forms a little coating over it, which neutralizes fire ant venom. So it's detoxifying fire ant venom. At that point, armed with its little wet shield, it engages combat again with the fire ant. Fire ant soon uses up all of its venom. Crazy ants win to displace the fire ants. So pretty intriguing, and another cool little thing that you find when you just look at these little details in nature. Well, let's step back a little bit and ask, why do some species become invasive? Because in understanding this question, it might lead to some solutions, to some answers. So one of the first and the foremost explanations that always arises is the enemy escape hypothesis. Sounds like a lot of big words there. What this means is that to become an invasive species, they may have escaped their natural enemies back in their home range. And those natural enemies could be competitors, they could be parasites, pathogens. The species that become invasive usually have very fast growth rates and high reproduction capacity and are good at dispersal, so they move around a lot. We often find them associated with disturbance, so we would term them to be weedy species. Now, those are general comments about invasive species as a whole. When we come to ants, there are some particular traits that are really interesting, and I want to spend some time on this. So, ant species that become invasive usually have multiple queens in their nests. We call them polygyne. Polygyne means just many queens. And that's different to the normal insect society where you have a single queen in a nest, the monogyne form. The invasive ants we've seen have this clonal spread. Remember those maps showing their spread across the field station? And there's low aggression between nests in that case. They don't fight. We see them packing into the landscape in high densities, and they're usually top dogs in competition for food, for resources, space. On the right here, I just want to introduce to you the ants that are on here. These are the two fire ants that we find in Texas. At the top is the red imported fire ant that we've been talking about so far, which comes from Argentina. And at the bottom here, we have the tropical fire ant, which is a native ant here in Texas. In fact, you find them around Austin, and most people here would not recognize them to be a pest because they occur in low numbers and they are few and far between. So the big deal here is that the tropical fire ant is actually a pest in more species, more places around the world than the red imported fire ant. And so this kind of goes back to that idea that here in Texas, these may be under some form of control. They escape that as they go to other places, as the red imported may have done coming here. Let's go back to this first point here about multiple queens, the polygyne social form, and talk about that and understand it a little more. So first off, we have the monogyne social form, which is the standard social insect form that you would expect, say, in a honeybee with a single queen. In fire ants, we see large isolated nests, and here I depict them in blue with boundaries between them, illustrating the territory boundaries that you'd get. And they occur at pretty high densities, about 120 mounds per acre, but their isolation between mounds also helps to defend themselves, those nests, against getting diseases from other workers coming in from far afield that may be carrying diseases. The polygyne system is the one of great interest for invasive species understanding. Here we have multiple queens per colony, small nests which are interconnected and actually form supercolonies. So this whole network of nests where workers and queens can be shared between nests occurs, and they all pack in at about 800 mounds per acre and are somewhat vulnerable to disease from foreign workers coming in. So with that understanding that we've got these two social forms, how did this arise? How can we have two really distinct social forms and yet they're still the same species? Well, some really cool genetic work has been done recently and have found that this is all attributable to a supergene. So here we show at the top a normal chromosome, the blue one here, with an odor detection status normal. This means that they can detect the odors of their nest mates and recognize other ants which are not their nest mates and defend against them. When you get the other form of the chromosome below, this is where a supergene has been generated by an inversion on the chromosome. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but what you need to understand is that in creating that supergene, we now have the little odor detection site no longer functional. And so that means that they cannot detect nest mates. How does this work out in practice? The monogyne has big B status, and its workers can recognize nest mates. They have a single queen. They don't allow others in. The polygyne form has the big B, little b, so it has the little b form, which disables their ability to distinguish nest mates and foreigners. So they have multiple queens. So basically what we're saying here is we've got a supergene which gives rise to super colonies of the superorganism. A lot of superlatives. Okay? Now, we've got an understanding of what we're dealing with here, what this problem species is. What do we do about it? Well, historically, a lot of things were proposed. Back in the day, remember they came in the 1930s, so there were all kinds of efforts, mechanical removal of them. We get emails all the time, people suggesting you should electrocute them, you should throw gasoline on them, burn them, whatever. But this guy was pretty ingenious here. He came up with the ant stomper. So this, I've seen one of these, and you put it on a fire ant nest entrance, and the ants come out of the little opening at the bottom there, and as the blades turn around, the ants get ground up. Sounds like a really good device. The only problem is that fire ants have got multiple nest entrances, and they're not going to stick around very long to get ground up. So Mr. McCoy, I don't think, made much money off his ant stomper, but this does show you the level of ingenuity that was required and the frustration behind these efforts to get rid of ants. So about this time was the end of the Second World War, and the power of science had come to be, right? Nuclear energy had been discovered, penicillin was available, DDT had been successfully used to knock out malaria and typhus in other places at the end of the war. And of course, this was then brought home to apply to forests, agriculture, and even urban settings. It didn't take long before this, what we now recognize as the abuse of DDT and some of these other chemicals, became problematic, right? There was a growing environmental awareness and a sense that the bioaccumulation of these nasty chemicals was not something that could continue. And this culminated in the environmental movement, in part inspired by the work of Rachel Carson, who was a government scientist who produced this book in the early 1960s. And she wrote about all kinds of horrors of the application of chemicals. And in particular, she took offense at this idea of using federal money to eradicate fire ants from 20 million acres using these nasty chemicals, dieldrin and heptachlor. And I'm just going to take a moment to read it because it really gives you the passion of the problem that was being faced and that she was presenting. She said, "It's an outstanding example of an ill-conceived, badly executed and thoroughly detrimental experiment in the mass control of insects, an experiment so expensive in dollars and destruction of animal life and loss of public confidence in the Ag Department is incomprehensible that any funds should still be devoted to it." So that's back in the 60s, and that's speaking to the what was the concerns of the day. So if you could not use these mechanical devices, you can't use chemicals, what do you do? Well, let's go back and turn to the biologists and think about biological control. Now, if we want to use biological control for the to help to control these invasive pests, we could look at natural enemies, and we should be looking for candidates and biological control agents that would be host-specific. So they should only attack, for example, in this case, fire ants and not other ant species. If we want to use them for biological control, whatever we want to use should be self-sustaining after release, and it should have very low future costs. But of course, it would bring some concerns because there may be some unforeseen collateral damage, so that they could end up hitting non-target species, and you could have host shifting after they're being introduced. And of course, they may only have very low impacts. What would be the point of biological control that would effectively be like putting fleas on a dog, right? It would just irritate them, but it wouldn't control them. So, in looking for a suitable biological control agent for fire ants, one could turn to looking at what diseases and pests are known in ants. And we'll start with a disease which is known to occur in carpenter ants. Now, carpenter ants are little ants which occur in trees, and they come down and forage on the ground. Sometimes when they're out foraging on the ground, they become infected with fungal spores. So this is a particular fungus that gets inside them and starts to grow and takes over and starts to feed on their tissues and actually wraps itself around some of their nerves. And those workers develop seizures and actually begin a zombie walk. So we're encountering zombies, for in the realm of ant disease here. And once they've become little zombies and they're walking down on the ground, they now would walk across, and the zombie is directed by the fungus to find another little bush to climb up. It gets to a certain height, and at that point, it locks on with its jaws, clamps down, it bites down, and it dies. Now, the next thing that happens is that the fungus emerges out of the back of the ant's head, produces a little fruiting body, and releases spores to reinfect other hapless worker victims, future zombies, right? So that cycle continues. Now, that sounds like a pretty cool biological control idea, but unfortunately, they don't infect fire ants. So the search goes on. One goes down to South America and finds a whole manner of natural enemies of fire ants. But this one stood out in particular. These are called Pseudactian phorid flies, and they're parasites of fire ants. We thought that these would be good for biological control because of an observation that was made early on in the 1970s at the Brackenridge Field Station. So we're bringing that back in to the story here. There was a graduate student, Don Feener, who was observing another species of ants, and he found that whilst they were out foraging, that when little flies showed up and started to attack them, those ants all retreated back into their nests. And that really interfered with his experiment. He was pretty upset about it, possibly, but that idea was just parked and shelved. But the observation had been made. When the fire ant problem came about in the 1980s, folks went back in and said, you know what, I wonder if there are any of those flies which attack fire ants. Let's go look for them. So the USDA ourselves went down to South America and found multiple species of these flies and brought them up. And what I'm going to show you here now is the encounter between a fly and some fire ants. So I want you to watch carefully, because as the fly comes in to attack the fire ants, you'll notice in some cases she's successful in ovipositing an egg into the ant. And she does that by trying to use a kind of an injection stinger at the rear end to squirt an egg into the shoulder joint of the ant. If that is successful, the ant writhes around, and you'll see that. If she's not successful, she moves on to the next one. So let's have a look. Here she comes on the first one, and you'll notice she's hovering, having a look to get her orientation right, and she goes in and she's injecting that egg, and it is a success. That ant is tearing around, it almost falls off the perch, and look at its stinger is out. It is not very happy. Here comes another one, and in that case, I think it was not successful. You can judge these for yourselves. But what I want you to think about is that how fast these little attacks are occurring. This is slowed down. These were shot at about 1,000 frames a second, and that encounter lasts for about 1/60th of a second. So what that brings to mind is that these flies are incredibly dexterous in their flight capacity. In fact, Dr. Gilbert describes this as being something like a duck trying to lay an egg in the back of a pickup truck moving down the highway. So these flies have got incredible flight capacity and prowess. And they carry about 200 eggs on board them, and they'll just keep going at this for as long as there's fire ants available, as long as she's got eggs, and as long as she's got some calories left. Because I think it's pretty tiring. The flies only live for about a day as adults. And there goes another good one. All right, so look at that stinger coming out there. It's a very upset ant. And she comes back in to check her work and possibly going to do another one. Okay, so that gave you the idea there of how these flies encounter the ants and lay eggs in them. Let's look at this in closer detail. There's a little simulation here where you'll watch the egg being injected into that shoulder joint. There's the egg. It's going to develop into a little larva, or a maggot, as we'd call a developing fly. It wiggles up into the ant's head after a couple of days and starts to eat out the ant head tissues. Mainly it feeds on the ant jaw muscles, and then after about 2 weeks of doing that, it turns on the ant's drive switch. The ant becomes a little zombie worker, and the fly is controlling the movement of it. At that stage, the ant leaves the nest, it walks out, finds somewhere that's safe, and at that point, the fly will release an enzyme, and the ant's head will fall off. It's decapitated in that process. That's a safe capsule for the pupation to occur, and in about 2 weeks' time, the fly exits through the ant's mouth. So, here's another view of all of that, right? If that was a lot to grasp, we'll kind of show you a little more detail here. So here is the phorid fly larva in red, right? It's sitting in that little chamber that it's eaten out of the ant, inside of the ant's head. The whole thing there is the ant's head. You can see the jaws at the bottom, the neck up at the top there. And you'll see the kind of blue streaks at the side are jaw tissue. And this is the phase just before it turns the fire ant worker into a zombie, right? Where it's going to make that ant move away from the nest. We've actually figured out that it makes it go about 5 to 10 yards away from the nest and then orient to go down a crack in the ground, somewhere that's deep and dark and safe, moist, and that's where it decapitates it and continues. So this is kind of fascinating, right? If you ever wanted a biological control agent, you'd think this is where you would go, right? But the question is, how effective would this be in controlling ants? And it's not just the killing of individual worker ants, as this would result in. It's not that killing of individual workers that we're concerned about. It's the effect on the colony. So here's how flies really would have an impact on a colony, in our opinion. So we've got ants out feeding on a little piece of tuna, and you'll notice they all get their heads down in the trough, busy biting off chunks to take back to the larvae so that they can spit it in and out, right? So here the ants recruit additional workers by using a foraging pheromone. So they lay that pheromone down. The flies are really tuned into the ants' foraging pheromone. They show up. They start an attack. You'll notice those ants have changed their posture. They've now stopped feeding. They've gone into an alarm, into a defense mode. They've got their stingers up, and most of the other ants have gone back down to the nest. When that happens, and the fly's done its business on attacking these ants, you could get a turnover of that ant, of the bait and the food item here to another native ant species. So overall, what we're seeing is that you may have a single fly show up, and that one fly may control the behavior and the foraging activities of a whole bunch of ants. Maybe 1,000 ants or more could be affected by the presence of a single fly coming up and harassing them. So that's where we see major power leverage in this encounter. Ants don't like being stung and attacked. They don't want to become zombies, right? So they build little protective shelters. They are across their food item. Here's a little piece of hot dog on an index card, and that's really upset the ants because they have to drag their little sticks and debris up over that, but allows us to see it quite clearly what they're doing. And this brings them to mind that very first video. Remember how there were some ants trying to cover a bee with petals? We think it's something similar. This is a kind of a defense against becoming a zombie, or at least being attacked. Now, you've all seen fire ant mounds, and you might do as I do, which is to walk out and kick them once in a while. And you'll notice here all the brood that are up at the surface. This is because fire ants bring their brood up to keep them warm in the morning, and that helps them to thermoregulate and grow bigger colonies. Well, if the fly shows up after that nest is disturbed, the ants cannot defend the nest and the brood as effectively, and that would be a cost to the colony. So the overall potential for using phorid flies for biological control against fire ants is a summary of the direct effects, which may kill only 3% of workers, maybe only a 0.5% or less, depending, because those are the individual workers which are being attacked by fire ants. That's a little bit like pulling leaves off a tree. Are you going to kill that tree by killing individual workers? Maybe not. But will you have an effect on them if you stop them from gathering food? We believe so, and we've actually shown and measured that that fire ants have lose about 50% of their food when they're attacked by the phorid flies. We've seen that flies can affect the nest defenses, and we also know that flies can carry some of the pathogens which affect fire ants. So there's a possibility that they could be acting a little bit like mosquitoes carrying malaria. They're carrying some viruses or whatever between fire ant nests, and we've been doing some work on that. But overall, we see slower colony growth and a stronger ant community. That is the expectation when we use phorid flies. So with that, we went down to South America. We brought up about 4 species to date, and we breed them in this mass attack chamber, right, which is, you could think of it as being a zombie breeding zone. And then we have released them along with the USDA and others at various points in the southern US. And this is Dr. Gilbert doing one of the first releases here. And we then track the dispersal of the flies once they have established. And you can see that little spread zone going out there from 2005 to 2011. They now actually cover this particular species, Pseudactium obtusus, covers the whole of Texas. We released it at many sites. We saw that it had really rapid spread across the state, and it's self-sustaining, right? That's one of the attributes we wanted to have with biological control agents, is we don't have to keep re-releasing them. They're in the population there. You can go into your backyard probably as soon as there's a warm day, and you might even see some for yourself. Well, we have flies out there. What are they doing? Are they having any effect? Are they present? What's going on? Well, we need to monitor them, right? So we have these little trays, and we go up to a fire ant mound. Little dangerous if you don't want to get stung. You have to excavate against the mound, put one of these things in, one of these traps in against it. The fire ants come boiling out, and they get trapped at the bottom of the container. And the flies are attracted to the commotion here and start to attack the ants. Well, after a while, the flies get tired and they settle on the sticky fly paper. We take that back to the lab. It's been out for 24 hours, only in one day, right, was the time that we leave them out, and then we count the flies on the paper. And usually we get, nothing, 10, 20, 50, but from time to time, we've encountered as many as 2,000 flies at a single fire ant colony in 24 hours. So these flies are out there in big numbers, and seasonally they have huge peaks, kind of like mosquitoes do. And we can't help but thinking that by now they may be having some impact on fire ants at these kinds of densities. So we turn back to the field station, and we consider what changes have we seen in the fire ant populations here at the field station and elsewhere in Texas, now that we have these natural enemies like flies and viruses in the system. So this is a study which is carried out again by students. Every semester they go out, every student sets out about 20 hot dogs on a little bait cards and counts up, do we have fire ants, do we have native ants, and identify them. And you'll notice here that this is across about a 16-year period, starting in about 2001, which is when flies were first established. And look at the fire ant population, or the fire ant prevalence, It's decreased by about 50% in that time. And if you remember at the beginning, when fire ants first were present, they were up at about 90 to 100% of occupancy in this type of a survey. So we can't say for sure what's happening here. We can't say why the fire ant population is declining. It might be because of the flies. It might be because of some of these other diseases in the system. There could be changes in social form, changes in habitat. There's all these complex reasons that might underlie it. But we are seeing changes, and we have some biological control agents in the system. So we will continue to study it. And at that point, I hope that I have convinced you that zombie ants are real, right? And that invasive ants pose a really enormous and complex challenge if we want to control them. So I'm going to end there with thanks to all the different people who have collaborated and helped across the time. We've got many of those members in the audience here, and to our funding sources, without which we wouldn't be doing this work. So thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you very much, Rob. Can you guys hear okay? All right. Well, I'm sure Rob will be happy to answer some questions. And so we have some through the Slido app. So let's just remember that. There should be one more slide that has that Slido address on it again. Maybe not. Keep going. Keep going? There we go. So you can ask a question here. And we have a first question that's come in. What about the use of beneficial nematodes to control fire ant populations?
Well, are you hearing me okay? So there are many things that you can use to control fire ants. And if you're trying to do it in an organic and friendly way, nematodes might work well. But if you're trying to do something which is going to be long-term and sustainable, you're going to run into difficulties of having to buy nematodes every year and continue to reapply them. So that choice is yours, right? What we're trying to do here in our program is to get a decline in fire ants generally. If you're trying to knock them out locally, be my guest. There's many good ways of doing it.
Here's another question. What predators could feed on the flies?
Well, not many, because the flies are so small that there are not a lot of insectivores that would catch them. Probably they'll get caught up in spider webs, but we're not going to see birds or lizards going after them. So probably little dead flies might be food for some other organisms at ground level.
Right. This next question comes from someone calls themselves Zombie Ant 1. Have you ever observed an entire colony being displaced by the phorid flies? How long did it take?
Well, when they say displaced, I guess that might mean move from one point to another. And we often see fire ant nests move because they do so seasonally, or if you disturb them in some way. So yeah, if there's been some disturbance on the nest and the flies are attacking them, that ant nest may well move somewhere.
What's the risk of the flies becoming an invasive species? I guess they are.
They're an introduced exotic species, so they kind of check a lot of those boxes, but they would not be classified as invasive because under the general understanding, an invasive species would be a pest. And we don't see these flies as rising to the level of being a pest. We think that they're beneficial. So yes, they're exotic, yes, they're introduced, but not invasive pests.
And the majority of these questions have been coming from someone called Anonymous, and they also have the next question. How do the larvae detect a safe, dark place from inside the ant head?
Well, we don't have a very good answer to that. We don't think that the larvae themselves are detecting that. We think that the ants are being driven there by the fly larva turning on some kind of behavioral module. So imagine, if you will, and we're not saying that this is the case, but this is a hypothesis, that there might be a module inside a fire ant that would be something would drive that ant to walking around and looking for a crack in the ground. So for example, if it was a newly mated queen, she would be looking for somewhere that she could establish a colony in a similar context. So maybe that little fly larva is whispering, "You're a queen, you're a queen," and that larva is heading off underground.
Sorry, I'm a little displaced here. Can the flies adapt to deposit their larvae in other insects? How would this affect the ecosystem? That question comes from Brooke.
Well, that's a really good question, and maybe I didn't tell you much about the effort that it took to ensure that these flies are very host specific. There was years and years of research and permitting that we went through to try to ensure that we felt comfortable, and the regulatory authorities as well, that this wasn't going to happen. So one can never be 100% sure, but not only did we do those practical tests, but think about this. These flies must have evolved considerably to be able to have that kind of a lifestyle as being a parasite inside a social ant colony. Think of all those steps that they've had to overcome, the ants' immune defenses, they've had to home in on their pheromones. There's all these levels of complexity that we don't think that that little fly is going to easily jump across and become a pest on anything else.
Okay, this question's from Anonymous too. If the flies would one day get rid of all imported fire ants, they were completely 100% effective, then what would happen with the flies? Should they have to be wiped out by another species too?
Sadly, that's probably what would have to happen, yeah. But no, that will never happen, because they will never drive the fire ants down to extinction. They are parasites, right? They will always depend on their hosts. Parasites, in a case like this, will degrade their hosts. If you think about it, all the other parasites that you know about, by definition, they're not killers. They just degrade the host. And so that's really what we're looking for, is smaller fire ant nests, fewer of them on the landscape. We never anticipate that the flies will knock them out, because if you think about it, down in South America where they come from, plenty of fire ants there, plenty of flies there, but everything at a much lower level.
So Dr. Plowes, are you saying we will always have fire ants?
We will always have fire ants, yes. But we would like for them not to be invasive pests. We would like for them just to kind of fall off that list and be something that we might have to deal with, but that they wouldn't rise to that level of all those costs.
So Christy has this question. In the last 30 years, fire ants seem less aggressive in central Austin. Could there be a reason for this? Do you guys actually notice the same trend as Christy does, that they're less aggressive over the last several decades?
Well, we don't know I wouldn't know about them changing their level of aggression, because that's something which is very individual, hardwired into a fire ant and into the nests. What you might be encountering, that so-called the apparent loss of aggression of contact, might be that there's fewer fire ants around, or that there are few of them in a colony when you go and disturb it in some way. So we might be seeing, over what we've just described there, over that period of time, some decrease in the number of fire ants. Maybe that's what she's seeing.
Right. This question comes from Zombie Maker. Do the invasive red fire ants have any defenses against the flies?
Well, we saw that one behavioral defense where they try to pile sticks and things and maybe flowers over their food items. There are other types of defenses, would be that they would have some kind of immune response where they might try to encapsulate the larva. In fact, only about 20% of the successful oviposition events where an egg is injected, only about 20% of those ever result in an adult fly. So the ants have got a lot of internal defenses trying to disrupt that fly development.
Thank you for keeping such a straight face while we converse back and forth.
This has been a challenge.
I get that a lot.
Yeah.
Not just on Friday before Halloween. Anonymous asks, how can the general public help you with dispersing or distributing the flies? Are they available for the public to purchase? So it's a citizen science question.
Yeah, see me afterwards and I'll sell you some. Yeah. Actually, One of the big deals with these flies is that after that initial investment and they're released, they're self-sustaining. That means that they're out there. Go and kick a mound in your backyard on a warm day and look for the flies. They'll probably be there. So you don't need to buy any of them. They're spreading by themselves. We've got about 4 species established. We're in the process of establishing another 2. So we're doing the work. You sit back and maybe get the benefits, hopefully.
Anonymous asks, have there been any observed instances of a queen becoming infected by the parasites?
That's a really great question, but the answer is no. We don't think that the queens will be exposed or will actually allow for that development. The whole structure of the queen's anatomy probably wouldn't allow for the development of the fly inside it.
Right. Ant Gang asks, when we're looking at an ant, can we tell if it is a zombie ant?
Yes, you can. You'd have to get kind of like on your hands and knees. You go up close to it, and if you see like blood scars and drips and things, it's probably a zombie. More likely, the thing that you would notice is that I told you how the larva is eating out the jaw tissues and jaw muscles. That means, and also the mouth parts fall away. So a walking zombie ant has got dangling mandibles, and it also is staggering and wandering around as you would envisage a zombie to do. So those would be 2 factors, and we can pick them up pretty easily with a little bit of training. So yes, you can.
Does anybody who's not connected have a question they want to ask in person? Yes. Okay. Coming right there. It'll take me a while.
By the way, great presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to shift and talk about the tawny crazy ants. You said, and quickly sped right past it, that we have 4 colonies, I think, here in Texas.
In Travis.
In Travis.
Yeah.
And you also said that they occupy a territory and crawl up your legs. How soon is it that we're going to be complaining about tawny crazy ants instead of fire ants?
The complaints have already started.
Is that a significant problem?
It is. The deal with the crazy ants is that because their dispersal, they're still at that early stage of dispersing through, as I said, nursery material and plants being transported around. We've basically just got these initial centers lighting up where the crazy ants have established and have begun to spread. They had the example in Houston where they spread across whole neighborhoods in Galveston, in that area, and pest exterminators came in month after month, year after year, and they basically managed to push them back into place. So they're on the rise here.
When you saw or measured at the research station that the fire ants were decreasing, did you also see native ants increasing?
Yes, indeed. Yes, we're seeing a resurgence of the native ant community, which is really encouraging. So basically what we see and what we sense is that the competitive scales have shifted in favor of the natives when the flies are present and attacking the fire ants. Yeah.
These questions keep getting better. Next one. Would the invasive fire ants interbreed with the native fire ants to escape the fly? How would this affect the ecosystem or food chain?
We think that because they've been in contact for that long, that any opportunity for them to interbreed has probably already happened. So we don't think that the tropical fire ant is going to interbreed with the invasive one. They're just too different. But otherwise, all manner of problems could arise.
Dr. Mook asks, since the fire ants are so pervasive, does this have any effect on the soil quality?
There have been some studies which have shown effects into the ecosystem when fire ants are present. I don't know about the details of those, but some studies have been undertaken, yes.
Okay.
So if you're seeing the fire ants decrease in population, I know when they first came, we had like a really big hit on our pollinators, things like butterfly larvae and things. Are we seeing the pollinators come back in numbers too as the fire ants decrease?
So none of those measurements that I know have been made. Those are things which remain to be done and are really important. We would want to see that. The difficulty is ever going to be pointing specifically at a decrease in fire ants and directly correlated with these returns of natives. It's a really hard experiment to set up. You can do it observationally, but we're hoping to see that as an overall pattern.
Great. Well, great questions. Great talk. Let's thank Dr. Plowes again for his amazing talk. Thank you.